The declarative procedural model posits that the learning, storage, and use of language critically depend on two learning memory systems in the brain: declarative memory and procedural memory. What's more, the model does not only account for how language is learned, processed, and stored in our brain, both Language 1 and Language 2, but it also provides literature on different techniques that enhance this process. We will briefly develop the main aspects of both memory systems to later focus on different ways we can foster declarative and procedural learning in our students. Now, let's see first what these memories, declarative and procedural, consist of. Think of what you did yesterday, or who the president of your country is, or what the Spanish word for flower, or when World War II started and ended. You may have found easier to remember some of these things while a bit harder to remember some others, but one thing is true. The answer to all these questions represent what we know as idiosyncratic knowledge. That is, knowledge about facts and events, or, in other words, semantic and episodic knowledge, derived from conscious learning mainly. It is knowledge relatively easy to retrieve and make explicit. Whenever we encounter or recall this type of information, the areas in our inner temporal lobe, those areas which are critical for the learning and consolidation of new knowledge, are activated, especially the hippocampus. This is our declarative memory system. When it comes to language, both Language 1 and Language 2, our declarative memory should be crucial for learning, processing, and storing content words. For example, cat, or verbs like devour, their phonological forms, their meanings certainly, subcategorization knowledge, for example, devour requires an object, spelling to sound relationships, irregular morphological forms such as write, wrote, written, happy, unhappy, happiness, unhappiness, happily, unhappily. Chunks of language such as idioms, popular phrases, set expressions, collocations, among others. On the other hand, try now to explain to someone how to drive a car or ride a bike. Isn't it easier to just show how it is done rather than giving a full account of the process? This type of implicit knowledge, not available to conscious awareness, knowledge acquired by doing, that reaches a level of automatization in our mind, is learned and processed in procedural memory. Procedural memory is located mainly in frontal lobe structures of the brain, including the basal ganglia. It is a crucial area related to motor and high cognitive skills. It is a system well suited for learning implicit knowledge about rules, sequences, and categories. When it comes to language learning, grammar knowledge is related to this system. Try even explaining a grammar rule in your own language. You may not know the underlying patterns of a construction, but surely you know how to use it and can provide plenty of examples. Now, a question arises. How do these two systems interact when we learn a language? Interestingly, semantic and episodic knowledge is only learned and recalled via declarative memory. However, when we learn grammar, knowledge is processed in both declarative and procedural memory systems. In fact, redundant grammar knowledge is likely to be learned and stored differently, though in parallel in one system and the other. For example, as chunks or explicit rules in declarative memory, like walked, and as implicit rules that apply rapidly and automatically in procedural memory, like adding ed to regular verbs. However, since declarative memory typically learns more rapidly than procedural memory, it will generally be relied on more initially. As exposure to the input continues, however, learning in procedural memory and corresponding automatization will progress, until at some point, the procedural knowledge may be strong enough to take precedence over declarative knowledge and thus be relied on instead. One more thing about declarative and procedural memory. Language learning in these two systems differs according to three main factors: exposure, age, and type of instruction. when learning a second language, grammar should tend to depend more on declarative memory and less on procedural memory. Why? Simply because we have started to learn the language later, so we will always have less language exposure than Language 1 learners. While declarative memory learns more quickly and procedural memory more gradually, at any given age, our grammar should be less proceduralized and should thus depend more on declarative memory than Language 1 grammar. Regarding age, learning in procedural memory is robust in early childhood and starts declining in late childhood and early adolescence, whereas the opposite trend can be observed in declarative memory. For this reason, when we learn our first language and learn a foreign language at an early age, we will acquire grammar aspects implicitly via procedural memory, while later Language 2 learners should rely more on declarative memory and indeed may never proceduralize their grammar to the same extent as Language 1 learners. Finally, our Language 2 experience also determines how we learn and depend on these two memory systems. Explicit, classroom-like instruction, which is the one we're likely to encounter when learning a second language in our context, may encourage learning in declarative memory. On the contrary, learning in immersion contexts where language input is acquired implicitly, as when we learn our mother tongue, fosters processing in procedural memory and encourages proceduralization and further automatization of language structures. Something is to be clear. Learning through procedural memory is expected in Language 2 and should be encouraged. But it is worth taking into account that they will never reach the same degree of automatization as in Language 1, because the later we start learning a second language, the less strong procedural memory processing is. Taking these characteristics into account, how can we improve our students' learning of a second language? Fortunately, the declarative procedural model does not only account for learning and processing in these two memory systems, but as we have said before, it also suggests some techniques that may enhance this process. More importantly, these interventions are aimed at fostering retention, which is the ultimate goal when we learn a second language.
In their 2018 article, Ullman and Lavlet propose a series of techniques in order to improve language learning. These interventions are classified into item level and learn level. Although these techniques may benefit declarative memory mainly, some of them may also help procedural memory processing. Within item level techniques, we can mention spaced repetition, also known as distributed practice or the spacing effect. That is, according to Cepeda, introducing temporal gaps between repeated presentations of the same item. Then we have retrieval practice, also known as the testing effect, in Radiger and Butler. This suggests retrieving learned information from memory instead of restudying it. These techniques could be combined. In his classes, Pablo introduced the topic jobs and professions using pictures showing people performing different jobs. The following class, he asked his students to take 5 minutes to write down what they remember about jobs and professions from previous classes. 2 weeks later, he used the same items of jobs and professions to deal with actions in the present simple tense. In the same way, after 3 months, Pablo tested the topic of jobs and professions using a quiz as a pre-reading activity about popular jobs in Argentina. Then we have deep encoding, which is engaging in semantically rich processing as opposed to surface-level processing of information. This is also discussed in terms of level of processing theory, Craig and Tulving. Also, we have gesture-based learning, also known as the enactment effect. That is to say, accompanying word learning with contextually appropriate gestures, according to Macedonian. Deep encoding technique is also used by creating chunks, which is a process in which individual pieces of information are bound together into a meaningful whole, according to Neath and Sapnant, to create meaningful categories. In this case, the lexical items of jobs and professions have been grouped according to different labels.
Let's classify the jobs into education, arts, health, and office work.
Gesture-based technique, also called the enactment effect, implies the use of gestures and body language for the learning of a language item, since they are better recalled if learners mime the action rather than get the verbal information or see someone else performing the action. Here, Pablo is introducing actions related to routines while making his students perform the action.
At 7 o'clock, he then gets up and stretches for a long time. He goes to the bathroom and brushes his teeth. He combs his hair and gets dressed.
Ullmann also proposes other techniques that are learner-centered, that also help language learning. As teachers, we can advise our learners to sleep well, do aerobic exercise, follow a healthy diet, develop mindfulness strategies,